Hey guys, I recently took some time away from the game after a stretch of some pretty disgusting run bad at NL25, and upon returning to the game, I decided to go down to NL10 Zoom. Just for a little while, just to get back into the swing of things. Now, here is my graph from the last week, and as you can see, I've played it just over 6k hands.
That sample size is too small. You need a sample of at least 100,000 hands.
Yeah, I know, it's not a large sample size, but I'm not here to convince you that I'm some long-term crusher. I just want to be transparent because the exploits that I'm going to share with you were all implemented over this sample of hands, and I don't plan to be playing much more at this limit going forward. Now, that being said, I do want to make it clear that I think these exploits will work pretty well across the entire spectrum of microstakes games, because I haven't really observed too much of a difference between NL25, NL10, and NL5. I just happened to be playing NL10 when I first implemented some of these adjustments. I also just want to make it clear I'm not a professional, I'm not a coach, even if I do have aspirations to one day be those things. So these are more just general tips as opposed to a deep strategical analysis. So with that all out of the way, let's get to our first exploit, which is to construct your own pre-flop ranges. Now, while this might not sound like much of a direct exploit, it is going to serve as a foundational building block for everything else that we are going to discuss in this video. If your pre-flop game or your pre-flop ranges are out of whack, you're going to have a bad time. You might have signed up for a training site at some point, and you might have been given a bunch of charts to use, but you should really go and sign up for the free version of GTO Wizard and construct your own ranges using the range builder function. Not only is this a great first step to building your knowledge of pre-flop ranges and how they interact with one another, but you're going to be able to identify spots where hands take certain actions at different frequencies. We'll touch on this more in just a minute. I made mine by copying them into a spreadsheet and using color codes to label which hands are pure raises, high frequency, mixed, or low frequency raises. Speaking of labeling and color coding, are you using a heads-up display? If you aren't, you should be. And if you are, you should be relentlessly labeling and taking notes on your opponents. I won't spend too long on this one, but I will tell you what I do, and that's to sort my opponents into different categories based on their HUD stats. And if I see someone show up with an unusual hand in a specific spot,
uh-oh, retard alert!
I'm gonna make a note on it for when I see that player again. Now on to our next exploit. Players at the micro stakes play way too tight and passive pre-flop. Now, I want you to pause the video for just a second and think about what the appropriate exploit for that kind of behavior might be. If your answer was to raise even wider pre-flop, great job. When constructing our pre-flop ranges, we identified hands that raised at a mixed or lower frequency according to GTO. Take this hand for example. Our pre-flop range chart says we should raise or fold this hand at a mixed frequency. If I thought my opponents were playing GTO pre-flop, I might use a random number generator here to dictate my action and remain balanced. But in this instance, I'm going to make this hand a pure raise to exploit my opponent's tendency to overfold and to under 3-bet. Speaking of 3-bets, our next exploit is another pre-flop exploit, and it targets our opponent's tendency to overfold to 3-bets and to 4-bets. Any idea what that might be? Well, if you said it's to 3-bet and 4-bet even wider, then you're definitely on the right track. Now this exploit is particularly useful in later positions like the cutoff and the button, where we still have a positional advantage on our opponent, so we're going to see a lot more hands that are 3-betting and 4-betting at mixed frequency. So just like with our previous exploit, we're going to adjust by making these hands pure 3-bets or pure 4-bets if we notice that our opponents are overfolding the 3-bets and 4-bets. Now there is one more pre-flop exploit that I wanted to touch on, and this is a big one. That is defend your blinds. If you've gone ahead and constructed your pre-flop ranges, you might have noticed that the big blind can defend ridiculously wide, particularly in later configurations. You're going to be raised by the button and the small blind a lot because players at these games do at least understand that they can be opening wider in later positions, but in my experience, they aren't very good post-flop versus a solid big blind defender. Now, I won't blame you if you do feel a little bit uncomfortable at the thought of defending a small blind open with a hand like King 4 suited or 6-3 suited, but if you do, you've just identified an amazing improvement opportunity where you can go away, you can study and drill those small blind versus big blind scenarios, and you can come back defending your big blind with confidence, knowing that you've got a significant skill edge post-flop. With post-flop play in mind, let's move on to post-flop exploits. The first one is going to be quite straightforward, and that's the 1/4 to 1/3 pot size Cbet. When we're talking about single raised pots where players just nearly aren't aggressive enough, you're going to take down the pot a lot of the time with just a straightforward continuation bet, because if you're playing pre-flop correctly, you're going to find yourself in those spots, either in position, having the betting initiative, or both. If we look at this spot where a weak reg flats my open from the button, we have a huge nut advantage on these kinds of boards, since we have a monopoly on all the big pairs, etc., whereas villain is going to have a lot of air and weak pocket pairs, and he should find it pretty hard to continue on a board this disconnected. We can lead out with our air out of position, or make a small c-bet when checked to, and get the fold a large amount of the time. Next up are the delayed c-bet and the turn probe. The delayed c-bet is when we are the pre-flop aggressor and the flop goes check check. There are of course going to be times when we want to check the flop, particularly when we know the board is much better for villain's range than it is for ours. Maybe we're out of position, or maybe we'll want to check back some of our value hands in position to stay nice and balanced. Whatever the reason may be, regs at this level massively overfold to delayed c-bets. So do make sure you're making those with your value hands and also with a lot of your air on those kinds of boards where the texture permits. Now the turn probe is a similar tool that we have available to us, but it is used when villain is the pre-flop aggressor and when we are out of position. This situation should mainly present itself when we're sitting in the big blind and we opt to defend versus a button open. I see you flat calling there from the small blind, mate. Cut that shit out. Now this is used when the pre-flop aggressor has the chance to c-bet, but instead opts to check back to us. People at this level don't tend to protect their flop check range nearly enough, so both of these plays can be absolute red line printers when used appropriately. Now the final exploit I have for you is one that we can use all across the board, and it's one that we can use to exploit our opponent's tendency to overfold to aggression. Let's take one more pause and see if we can come up with an exploit. If you said Bluff More, you're like the son or daughter I never had. I'm so proud of you. Now this one is going to be quite player dependent, but you need to start bluffing more when it makes sense to do so. As someone who used to have a really hard time not feeling super embarrassed when I'd get looked up by a bluff catcher after making a sizable river bluff with complete air, I can tell you that if you never get caught bluffing, you aren't bluffing enough. There is also no more satisfying and rewarding skill in this game to work on, in my opinion, than getting your opponent to fold a hand that likely has you beat. People at these games play an extremely value-heavy strategy, so you need to get comfortable with putting the pressure on with your bluffs in spots where it makes sense. If the ranges are more polarized and they do have a hand, they're often going to let you know. An important point of difference to note here, however, versus recreational and cooling station type players, is that you should be really careful about bluffing when ranges are more merged as opposed to polarized. You might be able to get that reg to fold his pocket sevens on a K-high board, the sizable river bluff, but I would be much less inclined to give the recreational player credit for being able to find that fold button. Okay, what the fuck did this guy have? A 5 and a 3. So there you have it, guys. There are some general tips to exploit the micro stakes and increase your win rate. Now, as I said, these were more just general tips to kind of set you on the right course. But if you want to gain a deeper understanding of some of these lines and some of these concepts that have been discussed, I do encourage you to go away and study them in your own time. I am going to be putting out a lot more video content going forward, perhaps 1 or 2 videos a week. So if you did like this and find it valuable, do me a solid and hit the sub button and drop me a comment and let me know what kind of videos you'd like to see going forward. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'd be super stoked to see you here again.